G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.2, In Babylon 2, Ezekiel and Job. In episode 2.1, I covered the inflammatory first chapter of the book of the great prophet Ezekiel and the mystical movements it inspired. Let's look at the rest of Ezekiel, and then get stuck into that most difficult of books, Job. Ezekiel has no concern with social justice, like the prophet Amos, nor with foreign policy, like Isaiah. Ezekiel fulminates against those who have violated the sacred laws of purity laid down in Leviticus, in the portion that scholars call the Holiness Code. Now, I covered that in detail in episode 1.18, the Holiness Code. Most of these laws are about sexual transgressions. Here's a selection of these perversions. Quote, Leviticus 8:9. The nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's, whether born into the household or outside, do not uncover their nakedness. Do not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. Do not marry a woman as a rival to her sister and uncover her nakedness in the other's lifetime. Do not come near a woman during her period of uncleanness to uncover her nakedness. Do not have carnal relations with your neighbour's wife and defile yourself with her. End quote. And in Ezekiel you get, quote, Ezekiel 36:16. The word of Yahweh came to me, O mortal, when the house of Israel dwelt on their own soil, they defiled it with their ways and their deeds. Their ways were in my sight like the uncleanness of a menstruous woman. So I poured out my wrath on them for the blood which they shed upon the land, and for the fetishes with which they defiled it. I scattered them among the nations. End quote. For much of the Bible, God has been Judah's furious father. Ezekiel follows the prophet Hosea by transforming God into a jealous husband, a role both more terrifying and more credible. Husbands are more likely to slaughter their wives than their children, and like every homicidal husband, God accuses his wife of whoredom. The Lord addresses Jerusalem with disturbingly sexual imagery. In a lot of jurisdictions, this guy would be arrested. Long quote. Ezekiel 16:7. I let you grow like the plants of the field, and you continued to grow up until you attained to womanhood, until your breasts became firm and your hair sprouted. I saw that your time for love had arrived. I entered into a covenant with you by oath, declares Yahweh Elohim. Thus you became mine. I bathed you in water and washed the blood off you and anointed you with oil. You adorned yourself with gold and silver, and your apparel was of fine linen, silk, and embroidery. You grew more and more beautiful and became fit for royalty. Your beauty won you fame among the nations, for it was perfected through the splendour which I set upon you, declares Lord Yahweh. But you played the harlot. You lavished your favours on every passer-by. You even took some of your clothes and made yourself tapestried platforms and fornicated on them. You took your beautiful things, made of the gold and silver that I had given you, and you made yourself phallic images and fornicated with them. End quote. And there we have the first known reference to a sex toy. I'll bet you weren't expecting that in the Bible. The prophet Ezekiel isn't finished. God is upset to the point of derangement. Quote, Ezekiel 16:28. In your insatiable lust, you also played the whore with the Assyrians, but you are still unsated. You multiplied your harlotries with Chaldea, yet even with this you are not satisfied. How sick was your heart, declares Lord Yahweh, when you did all those things, the acts of a self-willed whore. Yet you are not like a prostitute, for you spurned fees. You are like the adulterous wife, who welcomes strangers instead of her husband. Gifts are made to all prostitutes, but you made gifts to all your lovers, and bribed them to come to you from every quarter for your harlotries." End quote. Ezekiel also promulgates a few laws. Ezekiel is the only book outside the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, to lay down such laws, and the only book to contradict the laws of Moses. For example, Ezekiel specifies that a priest may only marry a virgin or the widow of a priest. The book of Leviticus says no widows allowed, only virgins. God commands the prophet to conduct a series of performance art protests, as God is wont to do. Ezekiel is instructed to build a model of the city of Jerusalem under siege. God has Ezekiel bake some bread. Now, this is worth quoting. Quote, Ezekiel 4:9. "Further, take barley, beans, lentils, millet, and emmer. Eat it as a barley cake. You shall bake it on human excrement before their eyes. So, said Yahweh, shall the people of Israel eat their bread, unclean, among the nations to which I will banish them." Then I said, Lord Yahweh, my person was never defiled, nor have I eaten anything that died of itself, or was torn by beasts from my youth until now, nor has foul flesh entered my mouth. He answered me, "See, I allow you cow's dung instead of human excrement. Prepare your bread on that." End quote. God commands Ezekiel to take a mixture of grains never used for bread to construct an impure food for an impure land. This has been bizarrely misinterpreted by some modern shysters as a prescription for a diet, not a symbolic act against one. You can find plenty of websites selling you the Ezekiel diet. The prophet spends most of his time blaming the Judeans for their miseries. All the other prophets did that, of course. Many prophets, such as Amos and Hosea, attacked the people for their moral failures. Ezekiel has no interest in ethics. Ezekiel ignores moral misdeeds. He doesn't care if you rob the poor or kill or rape, but worship outside God's temple in Jerusalem or fail to carry out a mandated sacrifice, and you are toast. He reminds me of an elderly bishop who turns a blind eye to the crimes of a pedophilic priest, yet is incensed if the same priest fails to perform Sunday Mass. Ezekiel's denunciations of Jerusalem are some of the most lurid in the Bible. He brings back the imagery of his first chapter to describe a slaughter in the holy city and God's abandonment of Jerusalem. Long quote. Ezekiel 9:3. Now the presence of God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house. He called to the man clothed in linen, and Yahweh said to him, "Go through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of those who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it." To the others he said, "Pass through the city after him and kill. Your eye shall not spare, and you shall show no pity. Cut down old men, and young women, little children and women, but touch no one who has the mark, and begin at my temple." So they began with the elders who were in front of the temple. Then the glory of Yahweh went out from the threshold of the house and stopped above the cherubim. The cherubim lifted up their wings and rose up from the earth in my sight. Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of God of Israel was above them. And the glory of Yahweh ascended from the middle of the city and stopped on the mountain east of the city. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God into Chaldea, to the exiles. Then the vision I had seen left me, and I told the exiles all the things that Yahweh had shown me." End quote. After 24 chapters predicting the doom of Jerusalem and whipping the Judeans, Ezekiel finds himself still enraged. He has a lot more spleen to vent. He spends 8 chapters prophesying doom for Judah's neighbours. Many of his prophecies were spectacular failures. Ezekiel was sure that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would destroy both the great Phoenician city of Tyre and the kingdom of Egypt. Some have claimed that Ezekiel's prophecies were fulfilled by Alexander the Great, who conquered both Tyre and Egypt. These are the same people who have a lot of old VHS tapes of Hal Lindsey's best-selling The Late Great Planet Earth, predicting the end of the world in 1988. How did those predictions work out, Hal? The final chapters of Ezekiel are widely held to have been written after the prophet, languishing in Babylon, received the despairing news that Jerusalem had rebelled and fallen. Before chapter 33, Ezekiel has chastised, whipped and lashed the Hebrews. That won't work now. The entire nation has been destroyed. Ezekiel must offer hope. He has no other choice. Quote, Ezekiel 34:11. "For thus says the Lord Yahweh, I myself will search for my sheep, and will seek them out. As shepherds seek out their flocks, when they are among their scattered sheep, so I will seek out my sheep. I will bring them out from the peoples, and gather them from the countries, and will bring them into their own land." End quote. The prophet concludes with a utopian vision of a restored community, centered on a new temple. The book of Ezekiel has a few curious passages I think worth mentioning. Scholars aren't sure what to make of them. Take this one. Quote, Ezekiel 16:1. "The word of Yahweh came to me. O mortal, proclaim Jerusalem's abominations to her, and say, Thus said Lord Yahweh God to Jerusalem, by origin and birth, you are from the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite." End quote. A key objective of the first 5 books of the Old Testament is to explain the Hebrews' origins in either Abraham's Mesopotamia, as Genesis tells it, or in Moses' Egypt, as Exodus has it. Now Ezekiel states the position maintained by modernist scholars. The Hebrews are native to Canaan and mixed bloods to boot. For the next curio, I present Ezekiel's take on punishment. Most of the Bible is adamant that God's punishment will be passed to the 3rd and 4th generations. That was the view of the Torah, the law of the people, and the Book of Kings, the history of the people. The biblical authors concocted an explanation as to why so many wicked kings had long happy lives, and so many good ones suffered misery and misfortune. They devised the idea of delayed punishment, that the wickedness of one generation would be visited upon a later one. That is how they explained why the godly King Josiah was punished for the sins of his grandfather, King Manasseh. Check out episode 1.42, The Kingdom Sundered, and episode 1.54, The Babylonian Conquest of Judah, for more about that. Ezekiel doesn't buy this idea of delayed punishment for a moment. I'm with Ezekiel. Quote, Ezekiel 18:1. "The word of Yahweh came to me. What do you mean by quoting this proverb upon the soil of Israel? Parents eat sour grapes, and their children's teeth are blunted. As I live, declares Lord Yahweh, this proverb shall no longer be current among you in Israel. The person who sins, he shall alone die. A child shall not share the burden of a parent's guilt, nor shall a parent share the burden of a child's guilt." End quote. By the time Ezekiel was writing, The Torah had been the bedrock of the religion for at least a century. Some parts of the Book of Kings had been floating around amongst the literate classes for a generation or two. Ezekiel was making a bold statement by asserting these authorities were just plain wrong. Ezekiel's less punitive idea became the norm thereafter, and the older belief rejected. For a third and final curio, quote, Ezekiel 20:25. Moreover, I gave them laws that were not good, and rules by which they could not live. When they set aside every first issue of the womb, I defile them by their very gifts. Now say to the house of Israel, Thus said Lord Yahweh, if you defile yourselves as your fathers did, and go astray after their detestable things, and if to this very day you defile yourselves in the presentation of your gifts by making your children pass through the fire to all your fetishes, shall I respond to your inquiry, O house of Israel? As I live, declares Lord Yahweh, I will not respond to you. End quote. This is just weird. God says he intentionally gave the Hebrews bad laws in order to defile the people. Nice one, God. He then hints that amongst these terrible laws was a demand for child sacrifice by fire. We know the Carthaginians did this, but we have no idea if anyone in the Middle East did, although there are some suspicions about the Phoenicians, ancestors of Carthage. A few other books came to be associated with the prophet Ezekiel. In a throwaway line in his work Antiquities of the Jews, the historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, said that Ezekiel wrote 2 books. We may have remnants of that second, otherwise unknown book. Modern scholars call it the Apocryphon of Ezekiel. It was quoted by a few Christian authors in late antiquity. The only actual manuscripts we have of this work are a few lines from a crumbling papyrus dated to the end of the Roman Empire. This fragment tells a story in which a lame man and a blind man steal and eat the fruit in a king's orchard. The lame man rides away on the back of the blind man. When the king finds out, he judges them together. The moral is that God judges body and soul together for their misdeeds. We also have a series of 6 fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, only published in 2001, that scholars have taken to calling Pseudo-Ezekiel. This seems to be based on Ezekiel chapter 37, where the prophet talks of the restoration or resurrection of the nation of Israel. We don't know if this is part of the Apocryphon. I'll finish this episode with the book of Job. I'm reluctant to talk about Job for 2 reasons. First, this is a podcast about the history in the Bible. The book of Job contains 0 history and floats unanchored from any historical context. Second, many people regard Job as one of the most important and sublime books in the Old Testament. I just don't get it. But I said I would discuss every book in every Bible, so here I am. In Christian Bibles, Job is placed as the first of the wisdom books before Psalms. In Jewish Bibles, it is the third of the writings after Proverbs. It could have been written in the Babylonian or Persian periods, but there is no consensus. The title comes from the name of its main character, a righteous man, Job, Eov. The setting is the land of Uz, not Judah or Israel. Some rabbis said that Job lived in the time of the Judges, others that he lived during the time of Esther, or even the time of the patriarchs. I have read that Job is the Bible's most difficult book to translate, with its highly poetic language. It contains a large number of Hebrew words found nowhere else in the Old Testament, and some from Aramaic and ancient Arabic. Any translation is tentative. Commentators have often understood the same verse or phrase in opposite ways. Well, that's certainly helpful. Job is a wealthy, God-fearing man living in fine style. Without warning, he is struck by a succession of calamities. He is stripped of his property, his children, and his health. All because God enters into a wager with his faithful employee, the adversary, Satan. Quote, Job 1:6. One day the sons of God presented themselves before Yahweh, and the adversary came along with them. Yahweh said to the adversary, Have you noticed my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and shuns evil. The adversary answered Yahweh, Does Job not have good reason to fear God? You have blessed his efforts, so that his possessions spread out in the land. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you to your face. Yahweh replied to the adversary, See, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on him. End quote. The adversary points out that Job is virtuous only because he is successful. If Job were to suffer, he would surely blaspheme against God. God thereupon empowers the adversary to afflict Job with undeserved misery. Will Job continue to be a faithful servant under this divinely mandated agony? The book's narrator makes a point of saying that Job's travails have nothing to do with any sin that Job has committed, but derive entirely from the adversary, who acts on God's strict instructions. Were Satan pulled into a modern court, he could have successfully argued the Nuremberg defence. He was just following God's orders. The rest of the book reads like a Greek symposium written in poetry. Speeches by his friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar alternate with Job's responses. Towards the end, another friend, Elihu, sticks his oar in to offer yet more unwanted, useless advice. The friends hand Job the standard biblical line. You only get whacked by God because you deserve it, even if you cannot work out why you deserve it. Job doesn't buy that. He isn't persuaded that he has sinned enough to justify the punishment he is now suffering. God, says Job, is simply unjust. We all know the old saying about the patience of Job. In his own book, Job is the opposite of patient. He is angry, he is exasperated, he is agitated, he argues, he complains, and he vehemently insists upon his innocence. Job has seen many wicked men prosper, so why is he, the righteous, being punished? The fundamental question is, if God is good and just, then why do good people suffer and bad people prosper? The Hebrews were not the first to ask that. That question had been wrestled with for centuries before the Bible was written. The Babylonians grappled with the issue at around the time of King David. We have manuscripts from Babylon dating from about 1000 BC, copied and recopied right through to the Roman Empire that struggle with the dilemma. In the last 4 chapters of the book, God speaks from out of a whirlwind to answer Job. God slaps Job with the biggest smackdown in history. The deity offers Job no comfort of any kind. Instead, he provides a terrifying display of sovereign irrationality, a huge, magnificent symphony of hectoring, bullying, sneering rhetorical questions. And once again, we meet the old Canaanite sea monster, Leviathan. God says to Job, quote, Job 38:16, Have you penetrated to the sources of the sea? Have the gates of death been disclosed to you? Have you surveyed the expanses of the earth? If you know of these, tell me. Have you penetrated the vaults of snow? Who cut a channel for the torrents and a path for the thunderstorms, to rain down on uninhabited land, on the wilderness where no man is, to saturate the desolate wasteland and make the crop of grass sprout forth? Does the rain have a father? Who begot the dewdrops? From whose belly came forth the ice? Who gave birth to the frost of heaven? Can you draw out Leviathan by a fishhook? Can you press down his tongue by a rope? Can you put a ring through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a barb? Will he plead with you at length? Will he speak soft words to you? Lay a hand on him, and you will never think of battle again." End quote. You, Job, are nothing, and I'm God. You know nothing of me. You cannot judge me. I can do what I want. God never attempts to justify or explain Job's suffering. And there you go. As I said, I really don't get the entire book. In the next episode of the History in the Bible, I present the confusing sources we have for the time of the return, including the notorious muddle that is the Book of Ezra. I'll see you then. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com.